Go ahead. We have to listen. The challenge right now in the time we're living in is making that safe space to listen.
Yes.
So folks of color feel like we have to lay down our insecurities to make you feel safe so you can hear my story about the challenges of my life. And then they don't get it, and it's almost like, personally, repeated trauma. So like, how many folks do I have to tell about my struggle before it really starts to sink in that, hey, I'm a person too, and your expectations for me to educate you when you could be educating yourself also. And really, most folks of color, for the most part, don't mind. We're getting kind of tired of it now, though. But that safe space, and folks of color traditionally and historically have been more welcoming because we've been ostracized so much. Mm-hmm. So we know how that feels, so we don't want to do that to others. Example is the black church. You can walk into pretty much a black church and they'll just walk right up to you and hug you. I have walked into some other churches where I said amen and everybody turned and looked. Mm-hmm. But that was my way of worshiping. Mm-hmm. So safe spaces for listening, that really goes both ways. Mm-hmm. And dominant culture has to make that available to us. Not just tokenism or checking the box. I mean some real safe conversations. Mm-hmm. And like the chief said, they gotta be willing to hear it without getting defensive. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm not accusing you, I'm just telling you my experience. Mm-hmm. And so it's that safe space, who creates it, and then who's listening, and then what do we do with it?
It's a good one.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. And I think, at SCC, we're doing more to create those safe spaces. We're going through a remodel right now in our multicultural center that will open up more space for students to have conversations, to start those conversations so that people can talk and listen. And so, we can always do more as individuals. We can always do more as organizations. And so this question is for Councilmember Wilkerson. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about undoing systemic racism. And so I'm wondering, what steps have you taken within your organization or personally to promote equity and change systems that do not promote equity?
Well, I navigate two systems, so I'll start with my part-time job. So since my appointment to City Council, and that's only been since last February, I was actually sworn in at the Martin Luther King celebration. I came to council to amplify the voices that had not been heard. And then to be a visible face of opportunity, not only for folks of color, but for girls. Quick side story, I was on the fence about putting my name in for council. My adult children were absolutely against it. But I had these 3 grandkids who said, "Do it, Granny, do it." They were just jacked. And every time I saw them, they said, "Granny, are you on City Council yet? Are you on City Council yet?" And so I realized the excitement, first of all, that my presence could bring to kids of color. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, once I got there, I just started talking about equity. Amazingly, I think it's been mentioned, but every time I sit at the table, I say, well, where's the equity in that? How is that serving everybody? That was like the first 3 months. Now, I don't have to even say it. Other people go, well, where's the equity? I can sit back, but I had to be there to actually advance the conversation, to keep my foot on the pedal, and I was a visible presence where they could not ignore that it needed to be included. So changing the conversation is one of the things. In my other world, in mental health, my parents started an assisted living facility back in 1976, which was the first and only one. Amazingly, my parents didn't have a high school diploma between the two of them, but they had some great allies. So I came on board in '92, and for most folks, I'm thinking, these are the regulations, I play by the rules. Little did I know, that's not really how the system works. Other folks were in the system just to defy the rules. It's like, well, those aren't written for me. And I'm thinking, if you don't want to go by the rules, then why are you in the game? Then that was my challenge of learning about the system and getting engaged. So once I really understood that particular process, and that was in government, that was a government entity I'm working in, then I start challenging that, like, why isn't that for everybody? What's your communication tool? How did they find out about that? Oh, you had access to that person? I don't have access to that person. So how can we make it equal?
Sure.
So really being a voice, I think, is one of the most impactful ways I have made a change. And, you know, people think that I am fearless. And for the most part, I am. But, you know, as leaders, we walk alone. When you're at the top, pretty much by yourself. Now think of that as a Black single woman navigating a white dominant culture environment. And I would have to walk into the space like I owned it, or otherwise my voice would not have been heard. If I had walked in cowering down, I would have been ignored. So walk in with that. And I gotta tell you, that's a challenging place for anybody, but you think of it for a person of color, and in most spaces, I am still the only person of color.
There's some nodding going on.
Yeah, there's a lot
over
of that
here.
that resonates with me, so
Yeah.
thank you for sharing
Laura's-
that. Yeah.
Larry's like, yeah. I wanted to ask a question to you, Craig, because we were talking when I met with you, and you were so gracious to meet with me. It's a tough situation, and I mentioned to you that I'm in both worlds because I have a granddaughter who is fully African from Ethiopia, American, adopted into our family, and so it gives me opportunities to see how does this play out. I found it so fascinating that people would come up to her in the store and touch her hair without even asking, and to get her perspective on it. And I have a son who just retired from 25 years in the Seattle Police Department, and have a perspective of how difficult it is to be in law enforcement with the current situations that have happened and all. And I just, first of all, wanted to commend you for going out into the community and talking to so many people. When I started talking to people about all of you, over and over again, people in Black churches who are friends of mine mentioned that you had come to their church to listen. And I think that just really helps everybody feel like that the Spokane Police Department is moving in that direction. What's the hardest part for being at the top of all of this? Does it just, the responsibility feel overwhelming sometimes? Because it would if it was mine.
Yeah, Councilwoman Wilkerson made a comment about, it's lonely at the top. And, there's a quote, heavy is the head that wears the crown. And that's not from a position of arrogance. It's from a position of you always have 30 different things on your mind, and you are carrying a burden for whatever organization that you are leading. And as a chief of police, you're in a unique position because to be effective, you need a department that's engaged. You don't want your department shutting down. But you also need the support of the community. So as a police chief, you have one foot in the community and you have one foot in the department. And you're really constantly working to find how do we best serve the community, knowing that I need to serve the community through the department in these different layers on the department. So between me and the patrol officer, you have basically 4 or 5 layers between us I can't be with every officer every minute, so you have to work through people. And you made the comment about you have the knowledge up here, but you wanted to get it in your heart. So as we're talking about changing cultures and changing the way our department engages with the community and understands that we don't exist to get a paycheck every 2 weeks and tell the community, we're going to take care of you, just go about your business and we'll tell you what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. It doesn't work that way. So what I find challenging as well is that it takes longer to change someone's heart. It's worth it, but it takes longer. And it can be frustrating. You can have some setbacks. You can have, especially in law enforcement, and we see it almost every day, one person can set back an entire profession. And when you're feeling like we're making progress, we're trying to make progress, and then you have a setback, it can be very challenging to not only rally yourself because of all the time and energy and your blood, sweat, and tears you poured into it, but rallying the officers as well and keeping them focused. And yet you need to do that, because when you get to the point where you can't do that anymore, it's time to give up the position.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like part of the challenge is how do you do the educational piece with people who are not on board with what a new agenda is that involves a different kind of being in the community. And you and I talked that a long time ago I was involved with doing some training with the Spokane Police Department, and found that exactly as you're saying, that the mind piece is hard to deal with sometimes and is a challenge, but the heart piece, it's really hard to let go and to make ourselves vulnerable. But I saw that happen over and over and over again with officers one-on-one. I saw, because letting me in as a female, and that they assumed maybe I didn't care about law enforcement, and I showed them a picture of Eric, which changed that, my son who's a police officer. But I think that you're in the business of, as you role model that, because they have so much respect for you, I think that you are changing things, and it may not feel like it's at the pace you wish it was, but I know how it was talking to you and how honest and straightforward and from your heart you were with talking to me, and I left that office with a whole new respect for you. And so I'm hopeful. I have hope. I have hope that Betsy's on the Spokane City Council, so I'm thinking that's so great that happened, and that you're there in the police department, and that Scott's at Eastern, and Lori's here, and I'm here. And if the five of us can't do this, we've got to do this. We have got to step up on this and work on the biases and work on the stereotypes and role model being vulnerable ourselves so that the people that we work with aren't afraid to do that. And so I just feel like sometimes it's 2 inches forward and 4 inches back. And when you see things on the television over and over and over again, I know talking to my son, he's just broken from it. Just makes him so sad. And that someone could do something so wrong, and then it reflects on everybody else because he never would have done it that way himself. And so I think having empathy is not only for the people who are struggling the most with feeling accepted and equity and equality and all of that, but it's also the people who are trying to help, whether it's teachers or deans of student service. Congratulations. We just have to decide to do it. And I decided this summer. I read two books, White Fragility, that absolutely blew me out of the water. And the other one was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. It's a fiction story, but it's a real story about how a young lady walks in being black and then going to a school where there are all these white people and just all the confusion of who am I? And as a mom of daughters, I could imagine how hard that must have been. So I think we need to not give up on making the little steps or making the little conversations and making the safe places. And you do that in your classrooms. I do that in my classroom. And I just want to tell you about one student, because I have a T-shirt, because I'm older than dirt, as one of my grandkids mentioned recently. Thank you. everyone asked me, when am I going to retire? So I had a T-shirt made that said, don't ask me when I'm going to retire, ask me the 3 reasons I'm still here.
There you go.
And Hunter's name is on my T-shirt. And we were in an ethnicity unit in an intercultural class, and we'd watched this video, and this wonderful young black woman was in class, and she was the video was talking a lot. It was a TED Talk about the pain of being black in America, and she just fell apart. She just couldn't stop crying, and so I took my chair over by her, and everyone in the class loved her. She was just this light, sort of like you are. And so I came over, and I just put my arm around her, and I said, it's really, really hard. And she said, they've said those things to me. Well, I'm watching a mostly white classroom watch this. And they all loved her. And all of a sudden they got it, that what they had seen on that film happened to her. And it broke their heart because their heart was involved. And so when Hunter did his final project, I meet with all of them, he came up and he said, did you read page 6 of my paper? And I said, well, it's going to be hard to read page 6 because I cried all over it. And he said, when I was in high school, I had a black friend, and I used to call him those kinds of words. And I went back to him, and I took him out for coffee, and I apologized from my heart. And he said, he told him that he knew he might never forgive him, but he wanted him to know that now he got it, and he would never do that again. And the young man said to him, I've been called those names over and over again all my life, but you're the only one who's ever apologized. So Hunter said, you have to keep teaching, Linda. So I'm going to have to die here. That's really what's going to have to happen. I'm going to fall over in the halls. But that was so encouraging that there was one student that understood what it was to say those things and the hurt it causes. And you're doing that within the police department. And it changes officers and how they feel, because you're putting your heart out there. So I just commend you for doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing. I'd like to add in this matter of what am I doing to address this issue of racial equity or the lack thereof. One of the most marvelous things about why I love teaching over these past 28 years at Eastern Washington University is because I get an opportunity to sit with students and present history. And of course, we're looking at African American history, but we're looking at it to see a broader scope, a macro view of human nature, and that what African Americans have experienced in this country from 1619 on is very telling about human interaction and the dysfunction thereof, aspirations, and so on. But my main thing in talking with students over the last 28 years has been just this. I'm here to provoke you into being a critical thinker.
Yes.
Not to come up with the same value system that I have, but the question is not, is that right or wrong, but why? We need to ask the whys.
Yes.
A riot, the Rodney King riot, 1992-91, it's not a question of is that right or wrong to violently take people's property or their life, but the question is why? What provoked that? What led up to that? What was historically and generationally so real in 53 individuals that they eventually went out to that street and lost their lives over that issue? The question is why? And so my thought is, especially in relation to this thing of racial equity, how can we help young minds not just rush to judgment based on what they hear or read or see on so-called cable news, but can they be brought to an understanding of how they reach their conclusion?
Yes.
Can you tell me, can you articulate to me why you feel that way?
Yes.
Not what do you feel, and I'm not here to make a judgment on that, but can you take us on a journey to show us how you reach that conclusion? And are you willing to explore the validity of that conclusion based on that journey? And are you willing to subject yourself to listening to others' journeys of what they've experienced? And so critical thinking to me, as I look at a classroom, I see, here's the future of America. I asked my class, how are race relations in this country? And they look at me and I said, well, I want to tell you something. It's in your lap right now. All I can do is tell you what I've experienced, what I've studied, what I hope for, but you are the future of this country. And if we can't produce our students and our young minds and our young leaders, Mark, I'm going to call you young. How you like that, sir? Okay. To be critically thoughtful and at the same time, not only be able to describe how and what's the pathway of reaching their conclusion, but are they willing to listen to others' perspectives?
Yes.
Because lived experiences determine what kind of perspective you have. And we have to learn how to, I appreciate, Linda, the matter of empathy is not just to sympathize,
Yes.
feel with a person, but to feel the same. And the only way we can learn that is by actually hearing their story. And so the issue of critical race theory has come up recently. And one of the basic things about critical race theory, which is so easily misunderstood just by its title or by its abuse in the news, is that we need to learn to acknowledge and validate the lived experiences of other people who are going through channels, waves, and generational history of systemic racism. And the question now is, are we willing to listen? And then are we willing to examine ourselves? The number one pathway to cultural competency is first knowledge of yourself, not about others. And the first thing we need to know is, why have I reached that conclusion? How did I get there about that issue or that situation or that event? And I wanted to ask you, Craig, I appreciate what you're doing here. One of our big issues in our classes is I always bring in an officer to present the truth of what a human being does that serves, like your son, the public. And of course, the whole issue of law enforcement and race, goes all the way back to the first police officers were actually slave catchers, that sort of thing. So that's always been there. But the question is, what do you see when I think of how to turn the situation today with law enforcement? Because I know 90-something% of officers in that business are really in it to serve the public and actually go home and see their family at night. I know that, and I believe that. But it's those few, it's that smaller group, or sometimes even a department in a certain part of the city of history, that completely abuse that authority. And rather than be the guardian, they're what's the opposite? They're called your work is to be guardians and also to be warriors or something like, right? Something like that. Why is it that the impression of just a few can spoil it for the whole? And at the same time, what can be done to give a sense of accountability when an officer does abuse or go beyond their authority? How can the public's perception be changed? I'm never happy to hear that, we're going to take care of that through internal affairs. That's not a good sign. How can we make sure there's some impartiality? And what do you think you could do? And how is it that maybe a kind of a conjunction with community first, before and first in the law, could actually make that law enforcement easier? But what do you think along those lines, Craig?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something I think all law enforcement, police, sheriff's office, across the nation, everyone is struggling with that. And how do we show the true heart of the vast majority of officers? And give you an example, my story is not unique. I knew I wanted to be a police officer since I was probably 3 or 4. I looked at it as a calling, and again, it was something that I just knew I wanted to do. And that is fairly normal, not exclusively, not every officer, but it truly is a calling for officers. And when we see some of the dialogue directed towards officers, it really hurts, because we know we don't do that. We would never tolerate that. The vast majority of us have never seen the behavior that we see on TV by other police officers. So one of the ways that we try to change that narrative and to change that impression is a lot of it starts with hiring. What types of people are you hiring? And a lot of it starts with that community engagement. So an example is we have a couple programs that the prior chief brought. Police Activities League during the summer and the Youth and Police Initiative during the school year. And that involves officers interacting with, in essence, children during the summers and the high schoolers during the school year. And initially, we had volunteers that wanted to go and engage, but we got to the point where we were running out of volunteers. So there came this dichotomy of we want officers to want to go engage with the kids. We don't want to have to tell them to do that because you don't ever want to force someone to do something like that. But on the other hand, a lot of times officers don't know what they don't know because they've forgotten. So we actually got to the point where we now mandate all of our new hires will go to a YPI or a Pell. And the reason why we do that is because it helps the officer every bit as much as it helps the kids that we're engaging with. And I was a victim to my schedule as a captain, and I went to one of these youth and police initiatives at North Central. And it wasn't that I didn't want to go, just not to go, but it was, I was so busy, but I went, and I left there recharged.
Yes.
And that helped me as I'm interacting with the kids on the calls I go to as well. Because when we go on a call, it's basically put a Band-Aid on it because we got a screen full of calls to go to. We don't get to really develop that relationship. So that helps our officers lower their guard, start to see the people they're going on call after call with as people, as humans, with emotions, with trauma. The other thing, though, when it comes to hiring as well, so I tell all of our new officers before I make the decision whether to hire them or not, every contact you have is an opportunity to deposit in the Goodwill Bank or a withdrawal. And if you're constantly treating people unprofessionally, disrespectfully, you're making withdrawals. And at some point, an officer is going to do something that is going to be on the front pages.
Yes.
Or they're going to be accused of doing something on the front pages. And I'm going to go to the community and say, that's not us. Either that officer did that, but that does not represent all of us, or that officer absolutely did not do that. There's more to the story. But if we have officers that are constantly being disrespectful, unprofessional, the community is going to say, we hear what you're saying, but that is your officers. Because every time we get contacted by a Spokane police officer, that's how they treat us. And so I always tell them over and over again that every opportunity you have, you need to try to deposit in that Goodwill Bank. And discipline is probably one of the worst parts of this job.
Yeah.
You go too hard, you're going to quash initiative. Officers aren't going to do anything. Crime's going to go up. You don't go hard enough, you're not changing the culture and that expectation of behavior. And one of the things that I look when I'm disciplining the officers as well is I tell all of them, you embarrassed the department. You didn't have a right to do that. If you wanted to go and behave in that manner, you can do that somewhere else. But I tell them, we have worked way too hard to connect with the community, and your behavior has damaged us and set us back. So it's really getting them to understand you have a role to play in the image of the entire agency, and somewhat by default, the image of law enforcement across the entire country, and trying to get them to think at that higher level. Don't think as Craig, think as I am a Spokane police officer who is representing law enforcement everywhere. And when they don't, then you just reinforce the consequences of what that behavior caused for all of us as well. Yeah. So we try to do it through the short version is we try to do it through a lot of engagement, getting out to the community as much as we can, and then holding our officers accountable if they stray, and while also acknowledging we hire humans, and there are going to be some that make mistakes. Some of those mistakes, we can use restorative justice. Yep, you know what, we're going to discipline you, we're going to train you. Other mistakes, you have lost the privilege of being an officer. You have just damaged the trust so much, you just can't be a police officer anymore, not with our department.
Yeah.
I
know,
know,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Linda.
I was just going to say that I know two of you have to go at 9:30, and Angie I promised her that I would get you out of here on time, and we're not done. We're not even close. So would you be willing to come back and do part 2? If we got a time that you could do it, if you would you talk to us about it?
Sure.
We would love to hear more.
And could we start with flipping that switch? Because he just talked about the perception of the police department by 1 or 2. Now, flip that over to the communities of color,
Sure.
1 or 2, and then we're painted with that brush, but we never get the acknowledgement that that's not all of y'all.
Yes.
That's just 1 or 2. So,
Sure. So having that communication go all the way
Absolutely.
around. Absolutely. We're just honored.
Yeah.
Thank
This
you
was
so much
wonderful.
for being here.
Thank you.
And we will have you back and find a time when all of the busy people here can get back together. We'll hopefully be in a little warmer environment. It's a little chilly. We're just so grateful. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. And also, here's to all of you. Yay.
thank you.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. peace.